With Lyndon Johnson's decision not to run for the presidency in 1968, the Democratic Party places its mantle on Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota. Humphrey had been Johnson's vice president during Johnson's administration, and that carries with it for Humphrey a considerable amount of baggage. That Humphrey should be linked to the Johnson administration is a non-starter with many potential voters in the United States. But there's more than that to Hubert Humphrey. For one thing, Hubert Humphrey has a long pedigree in the Democratic Party. As a politician from Minnesota, he is well known for his activities during the 1948 Democratic Convention, which, as you know from a previous lecture, was one of those sort of important presidential elections. Harry Truman, you may recall, had come out for civil rights, but it was in many ways Hubert Humphrey and a faction of Democratic politicians at the 48 convention who really forced Truman's hand. You never know what's behind someone's intentions historically unless they very clearly spell out, and in an honest sort of way, an unmanipulated way, what they intend. And even then you can have doubts. But in the case of the 1948 convention, Hubert Humphrey and a fraction of Democrats want to force the civil rights plank into the Democratic platform. And remember, Truman is already under considerable pressure trying to hold that Roosevelt coalition together. And ultimately, he compromises with Humphrey. It's also worth noting that as a result of Humphrey's efforts, the pressure in the Roosevelt coalition will push Southern Democrats out of the 48 convention. This business about including a civil rights plank in the 48 platform will literally push Southern Democrats, not literally, figuratively push Southern Democrats to leave the convention and form the States' Rights Party, or the Dixiecrats as they're also known, and run independently in 1948 outside the Democratic Party apparatus. So Hubert Humphrey brings with him, both for his actions in 48 and for his very strong support for the 1964 Civil Rights Act, he brings this huge pedigree with civil rights, working for civil rights. That's not going to sit well with, Southern Democrats. It's not going to sit well with many white Americans who are growing disenchanted with the sort of liberal politics of the Johnson administration. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the whole point of this is to tell you a little bit about Hubert Humphrey. But it's also then to suggest the political baggage that Hubert Humphrey carried. In the end, of course, Humphrey's the candidate for the Democratic Party. And it's notable that his election looks pretty, the prospects look quite dim. But one of the things he does is, as the election approaches, he will shift his position on Vietnam and holding the Johnson line, holding this strong sort of anti-communist streak where Vietnam's got to be held, and we've got to continue Johnson's policies, Lyndon Johnson's policies. Just toward the end of the election campaign, Humphrey gives on Vietnam. And within a relatively short amount of time, and it's a fascinating kind of statement here, within a short amount of time, his numbers begin to rise. His support seems to begin to rise. And arguably, if he had had more time, it may have been a very different outcome for the Democratic Party in 1968 than what ultimately occurred. And that has ramifications for sort of the argument that I'm trying to make in this lecture in regard to the emergence of a sort of new conservatism in the mid to late 20th century. really from the 1960s and 70s and 80s. Because if Hubert Humphrey had won in 68, then perhaps the election of 1968 wasn't that much of a bellwether after all. Maybe it wasn't so much of a watershed. Maybe it didn't so much open the door to the emergence of conservatives in American politics. And yet, another way of looking at this particular presidential election in 68 is sort of through the lens of another former Democrat who will run in 1968 as an independent. And that, of course, is George Corley Wallace of Alabama. Now, Wallace, I've already mentioned in conjunction with the schoolhouse door. You may recall that in 1963, Governor Wallace of Alabama did some political play acting, stopping a federal marshal just long enough for Wallace to give a speech. And in that speech, he basically decries, and this is going to become a theme for Wallace, he decries the growing power of federal intervention in state and local affairs. He speaks for the continuance of segregation. Then he steps aside and integration takes place. So on the one hand, he didn't accomplish much except in terms of a symbolic victory. And it's a symbolic victory only for those constituents in Alabama or, and this is important, on a national stage who feared that big federal power that Wallace is talking about. As far as segregation goes, Wallace is elected governor of Alabama in 1962. When he's inaugurated in 1963, Wallace, standing in the capital of Montgomery, Alabama, basically where Jefferson Davis had stood some few years earlier, Jeff Davis, you may recall, had gone on to become president of the Confederacy. George Wallace says, he uses this this well-known phrase, let's put it that way. As part of his inauguration speech, he says, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And those are the words of a staunch segregationist. This is someone who appears to be highly committed to the continuance and the perpetuation of segregation, certainly in Alabama, but arguably far more broadly. And yet, Wallace's own biographers have explored and conveyed the degree of complexity that really was caught up in what seemed to be some pretty straightforward segregationist rhetoric. Wallace, like most human beings, is a complicated individual, made more complicated, perhaps, by the necessities of political life, to hide one's own true feelings, if you have any, and, listen to your constituents and appear a certain way for political gain. Understand that in 1948, when the Southern delegation walked out of the Democratic National Convention, in 1948, George Wallace stayed behind. Wallace, when he begins his political career, it's really under the tutelage of Big Jim Folsom of Alabama, and he is understood to be on the issue of race, which by the 1950s is a growing issue of importance to Southerners. Wallace is seen to be, at most, a moderate. He's willing to accept segregation, but he's trying to hold this middle way and hold it off perhaps for a certain amount of time, but nothing like segregation forever. But in the late 1950s, his biographers tell us, Wallace endured a political defeat that really shifted his political campaigning, shifted his positions. Basically, he was defeated over the issue of race, over whether or not he was truly committed to segregation. And he promised himself that he would never be defeated in another election on the issue of race. that he would be more staunch in defense of segregation than anyone else. And lo and behold, he's elected governor in '62. And when he is elected governor, notice that, like at the University of Alabama, he is making himself the best known of the segregationist governors on a national stage. You know, he's taking the limelight. When we think of Southern segregation in the 1960s, the struggle against civil rights and integration, you often think of George Wallace, not Ross Barnett or others. Well, in 1964, Wallace decides to make a run for the Democratic nomination. It's really quite foolhardy. It's pretty clear that Johnson's the man for the Democrats, and Johnson will have this huge win, as I suggested, in 1964. But what's intriguing is that within the Democratic Party, you can see, and this is part of that fracturing and factionalism, you can see the success that George Wallace has in the primaries. George Wallace will have successes. He will make successful showings in Wisconsin, in Indiana, in Maryland, and just to give you some sense of this, in Wisconsin, notice, I mean, we're not talking about Georgia. We're not talking about Mississippi. We're talking about Wisconsin here. I mean, how close is that to Hubert Humphrey's Minnesota, right? In Wisconsin, in '64, George Wallace will take approximately a third of the Democratic vote. If you move forward to Indiana, it's about 30%. In Maryland, you know, southern state, right on the Mason-Dixon kind of deal. In Maryland, we're talking about something like 47% of the vote, the Democratic vote. Is he winning the primaries? No. But think about this, a Southern segregationist in places like Indiana, Maryland, and Wisconsin who is making headway outside the specific region where segregation plays so well. And you may ask yourself, how does he do it? Well, I think there are two things to think about. First of all, let's think back to the 1920s Klan, right? The Klan started way back when as a Southern phenomenon, but by the 1920s, the Klan had morphed into something with a more national appeal. It's in much the same way that George Wallace's candidacy will morph him or alter his image from that of a Southern segregationist governor to a national player who stands, if not to win elections, then to so change elections that he can shape the outcome of America's political elections. In other words, George Wallace doesn't have to win outright primary victories if his successes can be such that he can throw the Democratic Party a curveball, force the Democratic Party to negotiate, and even potentially, you know, be the deciding factor if elections are truly close in the Electoral College, getting the election itself thrown into the House of Representatives. That's sort of how third parties can work. They don't have to win outright to be able to shape policy and shape election outcomes. Same thing is true with George Wallace. And what's equally true is that Wallace very subtly shifts his message outside the South. And you can see some of that in what he has to say about federal intervention, his notion of interposition, that state authorities can stand in the way or block negative or unconstitutional federal law. Well, what that's all about is it's not using words that are directly related to race. Rather, he's shifting the focus, still talking about race, but he's shifting the focus to a contest between local and national or federal power. He's talking about the growing power of national government that we've seen with the New Deal, that we've then seen just re-energized in a major way with the Great Society and Lyndon Johnson. And the thing is, that plays outside the South. He's going to dull down this race issue, but he's going to denounce federal interference in local affairs like school integration. In later campaigns, he's going to talk more and more about busing. More and more about busing. But in 1964, you can already begin to see the elements that will lead George Wallace toward his independent run in 68. In 1968, he runs for president, but he runs as an independent. And so he's not going to be in the primaries. But the rhetorical plan, the structure, you can begin to see emerging out of 64. Well, in 68, like I said, he's going to denounce federal interference as he sees it. And that will include, especially as we move forward, forced busing to achieve integration of public schools. He's going to denounce government overregulation, and he's also going to talk about the social programs, government spending, and he's going to start focusing challenges to this liberal agenda, this progressive agenda of Johnson. He's going to start focusing the challenge on, for instance, welfare and public housing, again, tied to this growing, this expansion of the federal government and its social engineering, its undertakings. He's also going to come out in a big way in 68 for what you might call law and order. And he's going to suggest that a good bit of the rioting and the violence and also rising crime rates, particularly in inner cities, are the actual results of the policies of the Johnson administration and the Kennedy administration. And more importantly, the consequences of their ideologies, the ideas behind their policies. Notice at no point here is he talking about race. And yet, in terms of school integration, and often in terms of inner city neighborhoods that are racked by violence, you're looking at distinctions that often have a racial characteristic. That allows Wallace to speak to potential constituencies without having to use the language of segregation. The other side of this would be those constituencies, and I want to talk more about this in another segment, just a bit. But understand the tensions that are growing in America's cities and ultimately growing within that old Roosevelt Democratic coalition. The tensions are such that they're just about to burst that coalition apart. And race will be at the center of that political shift. It's for that reason predominantly that George Wallace can appeal in places like Wisconsin and Indiana and Maryland, because it's there where the blue-collar workers are most impacted by these federal policies. And it's actually their support that he begins to garner. So, how does this tie in, perhaps, to the larger conservative movement? Well, if we just look at what will later be understood as the Reagan Coalition, especially in his first election, going back to 1980, it's worth noting that Ronald Reagan will pull into his support base the so-called Reagan Democrats. Often blue-collar industrial workers who have traditionally been included in that Roosevelt coalition of labor, but who will find, for reasons of their own, largely the very reasons that Wallace is talking about, will find a new place in the Republican Party under Reagan. Now, the third candidate I'm going to mention in the next segment is none other than our old friend Richard Nixon. And I'm going to argue in that segment that what we began to see as early as 1968 is how George Wallace's candidacies began to influence the Republican Party. And some have even argued that Wallace opens the door for a complete restructuring of American politics, certainly for Southern politics. You may recall that traditionally the South had been the solid Democratic South. 1968, we're going to see that change. And we'll pick up there in the next segment.